The rag was old linen, soft from 1,000 washings, and Cleopatra wrung it out over the basin the way she had wrung out 1,000 rags before. Except this water was not allowed to be ordinary. It had been blessed at moonrise by the high priestess Polly, drawn from the spring under the eastern oak, and poured into a hammered copper bowl that had held the consecrated water at every Luna crowning of Iron Crown for 600 years. Cleopatra was not supposed to touch it with her hands. She was supposed to kneel at the back of the throne hall, holding the basin steady on a folded cloth across her knees, eyes lowered, breath quiet. And if the priestess gestured for water, Cleopatra was supposed to tilt the basin forward and let Polly's silver dipper drink from it. That was the entirety of her role tonight. She had practiced the kneeling in the scullery for 3 afternoons running, balancing a wooden bowl of dishwater on her thighs until her legs cramped and went numb, because the kennel master Yale had warned her that the marble of the throne hall was colder than the river in winter, and a knee that buckled in front of the court would be a knee that earned her a beating she might not walk away from. So she practiced. And now, here, in the small antechamber where the servants waited for the trumpets, she had a single moment to herself with the basin balanced on a low stone bench, and the rag had drifted into the consecrated water by accident when her hand shook, and she was wringing it out so no one would know she had touched it, and the water was going still. It should have rippled. She had just lifted a wet rag out of it. It should have been moving. Instead, the surface had gone glassy in a way that water did not go glassy, smooth as a held breath, and her own reflection looked back at her with an expression she did not recognize on her own face. Her heartbeat, which had been hammering against her ribs for the last hour the way a moth hammers a lantern, did something it had never done before. It slowed. Not in fear, not in the held breath way a body slows when a guard walks past. It slowed in the way a room slows when someone you have been waiting for finally walks in. Except Cleopatra had never been waiting for anyone, and there was no one in the antechamber but her. And what she did not know was that across the pack house, on the other side of 3 stone walls and a corridor full of nobles, Alpha Devon of Iron Crown had just felt the same stillness drop into his chest for the first time in 2 years, and he had mistaken it for grief tightening its grip again. And he had taken his place at the front of the throne hall with the Luna crown of his line in his 2 hands, and no idea that his wolf had just woken up. The trumpets sounded. Cleopatra wrung the rag dry against the inside of her wrist, hid it inside her apron pocket, lifted the basin onto the folded cloth, and walked the corridor with her eyes on the floor, the way she had walked corridors for 11 years. The throne hall opened ahead of her like the inside of a cathedral, all candle smoke and breath fog, and the smell of crushed winter herbs strewn across the flagstones for luck. And she went to the place she had been told to kneel, 3 paces behind the priestess, against the cold marble at the foot of the dais, and she lowered herself onto her knees, and she set the basin on the cloth across her thighs, and she became, the way she had been trained since she was 9 years old, furniture. There were 200 wolves in the hall. None of them looked at her. They looked at the dais. Seraphine of Stonewatch stood there in pale gray silk the color of a wolf's winter coat, her hair braided through with river pearls, her chin lifted, her hands folded in front of her with the practiced stillness of a woman who had been preparing to stand exactly there since she was a child. She was beautiful in the way a sharpened blade was beautiful, and Cleopatra, who had scrubbed Seraphine's chambers twice in the last week, knew that the woman on the dais had wept once into a pillow last night, and then washed her own face in cold water and gone to sleep, because Seraphine respected Alpha Devon and was preparing to love him, and knew he was preparing to never love her back. Cleopatra had not been supposed to hear the weeping. She had been on the other side of the wall, scrubbing the inside of a fire grate, and she had heard, and she had said nothing to anyone. Because invisible girls survived by never letting on what they had heard. The high priestess Polly raised her staff. The hall went silent. Alpha Devon lifted the crown. He had carried the crown the length of the hall in his own 2 hands because tradition demanded it. And tradition was the only thing he had left to lean on tonight. He did not look at the crown. He looked at the floor a pace ahead of his feet, because looking at the crown made him think about the last Luna who had worn it. And the last Luna who had worn it had been his mother, who had died in childbirth with his sister. And the Luna who was supposed to have worn it next had been Mia, his true mate, who had died 2 winters ago of a fever no healer could break. And Devon had stopped letting his eyes touch the inside of that circlet a long time ago. His wolf had not spoken to him since the night Mia died. Not a growl when he was wronged. Not a flicker when he scented blood. Not a single hum of presence in the long hollow space where, his whole life, there had been a second consciousness pacing alongside his own. The healers said grief. The council said time. Devon had stopped believing either of them after the first year, and had simply learned to walk around inside himself the way a man walks around inside an empty house, locking doors he no longer needed. Tonight, mounting the dais with the crown in his hands, he had felt the stillness drop into his chest and mistaken it for the grief tightening its old grip. And he had set his jaw and climbed the 3 steps and turned to face Seraphine and lifted the crown toward her brow with the small fixed smile of a man performing a duty he had agreed to perform. Seraphine met his eyes. She did not flinch. He respected her for that. He lowered the crown. He was a finger's breadth from her hair. And then his hand was not his hand. It was still attached to his arm. It was still made of his bone and his skin, but the muscle inside it answered something that was not him, and the wrist twisted, and the fingers tightened on the cold metal, and the crown swept sideways through the air in a hard, brutal arc that took a strand of Seraphine's braid with it, and tore a river pearl loose and sent it skittering across the dais like a dropped tooth. Devon heard himself make a sound. It was not a word. It was the noise a man makes when his own body steps out from under him. He tried to stop. He could not stop. He felt, for the first time in 2 years, the dense, hot, breathing weight of his wolf inside his ribcage, fully present, fully awake, and entirely uninterested in his opinion. The wolf walked him down off the dais. 3 steps, 4, 5, the length of the throne hall, past the rows of standing nobles whose mouths were opening into a single shared shape of horror, past the high priestess who lifted her staff and then let it drop again because there was no right for this and she knew it, past the council seats where Lord Tenley half rose from his chair and was waved back down by his own stunned wife, past the smell of candle smoke and crushed winter herbs and someone's perfume gone sour with shock, all the way to the back of the hall, where an Omega in a gray apron knelt with a basin of consecrated water across her thighs and her eyes on the floor. The wolf stopped Devon's body in front of her. He could feel his own breath sawing in his chest. He could feel his hand shaking around the crown. He could feel Seraphine, behind him, motionless on the dais. Not yet crying, because Seraphine of Stonewatch had been trained out of public crying when she was 12. He tried to speak. The wolf did not let him. The wolf lowered Devon's hand. The crown settled, cold and old and impossibly heavy, on Cleopatra's wet, kneeling head. Her hair was damp at the temples from scrubbing the antechamber floor an hour earlier. A bead of water rolled down from under the circlet and traced the line of her jaw. She had not yet looked up. The wolf, inside Devon, did not speak, did not explain, did not even hum. It simply released his body the way a hand releases a stone, and Devon staggered back half a step on his own legs again, and the throne hall, all 200 wolves of it, drew in a single audible breath. And somewhere in the back of the hall, behind a half-open door, a young hound began to whine. The whining was the puppy. She was 4 months old and unnamed, because Mia had been the one meant to name her. And after Mia died, no one in the kennels could bring themselves to do it. The kennel master Yale fed her by hand and called her Girl, and let her sleep on the foot of his cot through the winter. And tonight, he had tied her in the kennel yard with a scrap of Mia's old riding glove for company, so she would not howl during the ceremony. The puppy had chewed through the leash an hour ago. She had been patting the corridors looking for Devon, because the puppy thought Devon smelled like the woman she half remembered. And now she nosed open the throne hall door with her shoulder and trotted into the silence on her 2 big paws. And every wolf in the hall turned its head toward the small wet sound of her nails on the marble, grateful for anything to look at besides what had just happened. The puppy did not go to Devon. She did not go to Seraphine. She went in a wobbling line around the edge of the crowd and through the legs of 3 startled nobles and across the empty floor that had just been crossed by her alpha, and she lay down across the bare feet of the kneeling Omega with the crown on her head, and she put her chin on Cleopatra's ankle, and she closed her eyes. Cleopatra had still not looked up. The weight of the crown was unfamiliar on her hair. It was heavier than she would have guessed. It sat slightly crooked because the wolf had not bothered to settle it straight. A bead of water was making its slow way down the bridge of her nose. She could feel the puppy's warm breath against her ankle bone. She could feel the consecrated water in the basin against her thighs. She could feel the stillness in her chest where her heartbeat had been loudest a moment ago. And she did not know what to do with any of it. So she did what she had been doing for 11 years. She stayed exactly where she was. The first voice that spoke was Lord Tenley. He was an old man, the longest sitting member of Devon's council, and he had been at 3 previous crownings. And his voice came out the way an old man's voice comes out when he is trying very hard to sound calm. He said the Alpha was unwell. He said the ceremony would be paused. He said the High Priestess would speak in a moment. He did not say the words mad or feral or broken, but every wolf in the hall heard them anyway, because every wolf in the hall was already thinking them. Cleopatra heard them too. She understood, kneeling there with a 600-year-old crown sitting crooked on her wet hair and a puppy across her feet, that the entire court had decided in the same heartbeat that Alpha Devon's wolf had gone feral with grief and chosen at random. And that meant the crown on her head was not a verdict on her at all. It was a diagnosis on him. The relief that washed through her was so sharp it almost hurt. She had been bracing, for the half second after the metal touched her hair, for someone to scream witch and for a guard to drag her into the courtyard and open her throat over the snow. Because that was what happened to invisible girls who were suddenly visible. And the fact that the court was instead murmuring about the Alpha's broken animal meant Cleopatra was, for 1 more hour at least, the kind of problem that could be solved by simply taking the crown off her head. Polly the priestess stepped down from the dais. Her robes whispered against the flagstones. She was a small woman, sun-browned and gentle-faced, and Cleopatra had once spent an afternoon helping her sort dried valerian in a still room and had liked her, in the careful way an Omega was allowed to like anyone. Polly crossed the hall and stopped in front of Cleopatra and crouched down so that they were eye to eye. And Cleopatra finally lifted her face. Polly's expression was not what Cleopatra expected. It was not pity. It was not contempt. It was the careful, measuring look of a woman who had spent 40 years of her life reading omens for a living and had just been handed one she could not read. Polly's eyes moved from the crown on Cleopatra's head to the puppy across her feet, to the basin in her lap, to the stillness that anyone with priestess training could feel pouring off the Omega in slow waves. And her mouth tightened. She did not reach for the crown. She turned, instead, on her heel, and she walked back across the throne hall to Alpha Devon, and she said, loud enough for the whole court to hear, that the crown of Iron Crown had never been rejected in 600 years, and would not be unmade tonight by haste. The high priestess of Iron Crown had just refused to take the crown off Cleopatra's head, and the throne hall, which had been holding one shared breath, let it out as a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a growl. And Devon, standing alone at the foot of his own dais, with both his hands empty and his wolf gone quiet inside him again, finally turned and looked at the Omega the wolf had chosen, and saw her for the first time in 11 years of her scrubbing his floors. She was thin. That was the first thing he registered, because alphas registered bodies before faces, and Cleopatra's body was the body of a woman who had been fed exactly enough to keep working, and not a mouthful more. Her wrists, where they emerged from the rolled sleeves of the gray apron, were narrow enough that he could have closed his hand around both of them at once. Her hair was the color of wet straw, undistinguished, scraped back into a knot at her nape that had come half loose during the kneeling. Her face, lifted now to meet the priestesses, was a face he had passed in corridors and not registered, the same way a man does not register the shape of the door hinges in his own house. She had a long throat, a small chin, eyes that he could not see the color of from where he was standing, because she had dropped them again the moment Polly turned away. The crown sat crooked on her hair, and water was beading on the gold filigree from the damp of her scalp. And the puppy, Mia's puppy, the puppy Devon could not bring himself to enter the kennels and look at for 2 years, was lying across her bare feet with the trust of an animal that had decided. Devon's chest hurt. Not in the dull, pack-down way it had hurt for 2 winters. It hurt the way it hurt when a limb that had gone numb began to wake up, and the blood came rushing back in. He did not understand. He did not have to understand to know that something inside him, something he had buried in a hole and shoveled dirt over and never spoken of again, had just put its head up out of the dirt and was looking around. He could not afford that. Not in front of 200 wolves. He locked his jaw. He turned to Polly. He kept his voice quiet, because a quiet voice carried in a hall like this better than a loud one. He asked the priestess what she meant. Polly did not look at him when she answered. She looked at the carved oak of the dais. She said the crown was old, and the crown had laws older than the council. And one of those laws was that a circlet placed by an alpha on a Luna's head could not be unmade except by the alpha's own free hand the next dawn, and that any attempt to remove it before dawn by another's hand would be a desecration. Devon had grown up on the laws of the crown. He knew that one. He had simply never imagined any version of his life in which it would matter. He looked at Polly. Polly looked at the dais. He understood, with a slow, cold clarity, that the priestess was not protecting Cleopatra. The priestess was protecting the crown. The priestess had felt something she could not name when she had crouched in front of the Omega. And rather than rule on it in front of a court that was already half decided, she was buying everyone until sunrise. Sunrise was 7 hours away. Devon turned, finally, to Seraphine. She had come down from the dais on her own. She was standing 3 paces from him, her hands still folded in front of her, her chin still up, the strand of braid the crown had torn loose hanging now against her cheek. Her gray eyes were very bright and entirely dry. He owed her words. He did not have them. He said her name. She lifted one hand, small and controlled, and stopped him. She said, in a voice pitched only for him, that whatever had happened on that dais had not been him, and she would not be the woman who demanded a man cut his own wolf's throat to put a crown on her head, and that she was returning to her father's quarters until dawn, and would expect a private word with him after. And then she walked, slow and straight-spined, the length of the throne hall and out the side door, and the entire court watched her go with the silent, collective relief of people watching a near disaster veer wide. Devon let out a breath he had not known he was holding. He turned back. The hall was waiting on him. He could feel Tenley's eyes on him, and the council's eyes on him, and the high priestess's careful averted gaze, and, at the back of the hall, the unmoving figure of the kneeling Omega with the crown on her wet head and the puppy across her feet. And he made the only decision he could make in front of his court, which was to make no decision at all. He said the Luna crown would rest where it had been placed until sunrise, in accordance with the law Polly had cited. He said the woman wearing it would be lodged for the night in the Western Tower Chamber, under guard, for her own protection and for the dignity of the rite. He said the council would convene at dawn to determine what was to be done. He did not look at Cleopatra when he said any of it. He did not trust his face. He gestured to 2 of his own guards, men he had known since boyhood, men whose loyalty he was certain of, and he watched them cross the hall and help the Omega to her feet, and the basin of consecrated water tipped sideways out of her lap and spilled across the flagstones in a wide, flat sheet. And the puppy scrambled up and shook herself and trotted at Cleopatra's heels as if she had been doing it her whole life. And the 3 of them, guards, Omega, puppy, disappeared through the eastern arch toward the western tower. And Devon stood alone in the center of his own throne hall, with the high priestess's words ringing in his ears, and his wolf inside him gone quiet again, deliberately quiet, the way a child goes quiet after slamming a door, and he understood that he had 7 hours. The Western Tower chamber had a fire in it and a narrow bed with a wool blanket and a tall slit window that looked east toward the kennel yard. And Cleopatra stood in the middle of it after the guards bolted the door from the outside and did not know where to put her hands. She had never been alone in a room with a fire in it. The crown sat on her head. The puppy sat on the rug. The rag from the antechamber was still balled inside her apron pocket, faintly damp. She lifted her hands very slowly to the crown and did not touch it. She had been told by no one to take it off, and she had been told by no one to keep it on. And she understood, with the practical animal clarity of a person who had survived 11 years of not being allowed to make decisions, that touching the crown without permission was the kind of thing that ended an invisible girl's life. So she left it. She walked, careful in her bare feet, to the slit window and looked out. The kennel yard below was lit by 2 lanterns and a thin moon, and Yale, the kennel master, was standing in the middle of it, staring up at the tower with his hands on his hips. And when he saw her face in the slit window, he raised one hand, awkward, in something that was almost a wave. Cleopatra raised hers back before she remembered that omegas were not supposed to wave at kennel masters. And then she remembered that an hour ago she had been an omega, and now she was something the entire pack house was arguing about, and the rules might not be the same anymore. And the thought made her so dizzy she had to sit down on the edge of the bed. The puppy padded over and put her chin on Cleopatra's knee. Cleopatra looked down at her. She had seen this puppy before. Yale had walked her past the scullery door 3 times this week, half-grown and big-pawed and serious-faced, and the kitchen women had whispered that the puppy was Mia's, that the kennel master kept her alive out of sentiment, that the alpha could not bring himself to look at her. Cleopatra had not known the dead Luna. She had only ever seen Mia from a distance, walking in the herb garden in the mornings, and she had thought, in the careful way an omega was allowed to think about a Luna, that the woman had a kind face. She put her hand slowly on the puppy's head. The puppy sighed and pressed her skull up into the palm. The stillness in Cleopatra's chest deepened. Not bigger, not louder, just more present, the way the silence in a chapel was more present than the silence in a storeroom. And Cleopatra did not have words for any of it. So she sat on the edge of the bed in the western tower with a 600-year-old crown on her head and the dead Luna's puppy under her hand, and waited for someone to come tell her what she was going to be. The someone, when she came, was not who Cleopatra expected. She had expected a guard. She had expected, in her worst imaginings, Seraphine herself, or one of Seraphine's father's men, or even Lord Tenley with a knife and a quiet apology. She had not expected the high priestess. Polly unbolted the door herself, slipped inside with a covered basket, and bolted it again behind her. And she set the basket down on the small table by the fire, and turned and looked at Cleopatra for a long moment without speaking. Then she crossed the room and sat down on the bed beside her, and she did the thing no one in the pack house had done to Cleopatra in 11 years. She took Cleopatra's hand in both of her own. Cleopatra's hand was rough from lye and cold from the marble. Polly's hands were warm. Polly said her name. Polly said it like a person, not like a chore. Cleopatra of the scullery, Polly said. Who are your people? Cleopatra told her. There was not much to tell. Her mother had been a laundress in a border village that had been absorbed into Iron Crown when Cleopatra was 6. Her father she had never known. Her mother had died of a winter cough when Cleopatra was 9, and the pack house had taken her in to scrub floors because a 9-year-old omega without parents was either useful or dead, and Cleopatra had elected useful. There was no grandmother whispered to be a witch. There was no great-aunt who had run with the old kings. There was no lineage. There was a laundress, a winter cough, and a scrub brush. Polly listened. Polly nodded. Polly did not look disappointed exactly, but she did look, briefly, like a woman who had been hoping for a different answer and was now adjusting to the answer she had received. She squeezed Cleopatra's hand. She said, quietly, that she had felt something in the hall when she had crouched in front of her, and she had been hoping it was something she could name. And Cleopatra's family tree did not give her anything to name it with. Cleopatra, who had been holding herself rigidly together since the crown touched her head, felt something in her crack at that. She said, in a voice she did not entirely recognize as her own, that she was sorry. She said she did not know why the wolf had done it. She said she would take the crown off right now if Polly would let her. Polly shook her head. Polly said that was not how the law worked, and even if it had been, Polly was not yet certain it was the right thing. Cleopatra stared at her. Polly smiled, small and tired. Polly said that in 40 years of priestesshood, she had learned that the things the wolves chose did not always need a bloodline to justify them, and that sometimes the gods chose ordinary, and that an ordinary choice was harder for a court to live with than a prophetic one, but not necessarily a wrong one. Then Polly stood up. She uncovered the basket. There was bread in it, and cheese, and a small flask of warmed wine. She said Cleopatra should eat. She said she would come back before dawn. She said, with her hand on the door, that whatever happened in the council chamber at sunrise, Cleopatra was not to lie about anything she had felt tonight, because Polly had a feeling the truth was going to matter more than any of them yet understood. Then she was gone, the bolt scraping behind her, and Cleopatra sat alone with the puppy and the bread and the crown. And outside the slit window, the kennel yard lanterns burned, and somewhere across the pack house, Alpha Devon was sitting in his private study with both his hands flat on the surface of his desk, trying for the first time in 2 years to speak to his wolf. And his wolf, the bastard, was still not answering. Devon had locked the study door behind him because he did not trust himself to be seen. The fire was banked low. The desk was a slab of dark oak that had belonged to his father and his father's father, and there was a single carved figure on it, a little wolf the length of his thumb, that Mia had whittled for him in the 3rd week of their courtship, and that he had not been able to move from the desk in 2 years, even when the sight of it stopped his breath. He pressed both palms flat against the wood on either side of the carving, and he closed his eyes, and he reached, the way he had been taught as a boy, into the hollow space inside his own ribs where the second consciousness lived. For the first 6 months after Mia died, he had reached every day. For the next 6 months, he had reached every week. For the last year, he had stopped reaching, because reaching into emptiness and finding emptiness was a particular form of grief that he could not keep performing without breaking. Tonight he reached, and the space was not empty. The wolf was there. He could feel it. He could feel the dense heat of it packed tight against the inside of his sternum, the way a hound presses its body against a closed door from the other side. But the wolf would not turn its head. The wolf would not speak. The wolf had done its one impossible thing in the throne hall and was now, evidently, refusing further comment. He said its name. He said it inside himself. The old private name only he and the wolf had ever known, and the wolf did not answer. He said, "Please." The wolf did not answer. He said, out loud, into the empty study, "Why her?" The wolf did not answer. He stood there with his palms on the desk and the carving between them, and felt rage move through him in a slow, hot tide. And then, under the rage, he felt something worse, which was the bare animal relief of knowing that his wolf was alive. He had not realized until this moment how much of the last 2 years he had spent believing he had killed it. That when Mia died, the wolf had died with her, and Devon had simply been a man walking around inside a hollow shape, performing the duties of an alpha without the second self that made an alpha what he was. He had told no one. He had let the council believe the wolf was suppressed, biding, mourning. He had let Polly believe it was a deep grief sleep. He had let himself, in the worst hours, believe it was gone. It was not gone. It was sitting inside his chest right now, deliberately silent, having just walked his body across his own throne hall to put his lion's crown on an Omega's head, and he did not know whether to weep or to roar. He did neither. There was a knock at the study door. He recognized the rhythm. It was Tenley. He let him in. Lord Tenley was 70 years old and had been on the Ironkin Council since before Devon could walk. And he came into the study with the slow, careful step of a man who had been preparing what he was going to say for the entire walk down the corridor. He did not sit. He stood across the desk from Devon and looked at him for a long moment, and then he said very gently that he had served 3 alphas and watched 2 of them lose their wolves to grief, and that there was no shame in what had happened tonight, and that the council would understand, and that by dawn they could have a quiet ruling drawn up that named the placement a casualty of mourning, and returned the crown to Seraphine, and pensioned the Omega off to a vassal village where no one would know her, and the pack house could close the door on the whole night by midday. Devon listened. He kept his face still. He understood that Tenley was offering him a mercy. He also understood, in the back of his mind where strategy lived, that Tenley had moved fast. Faster than a 70-year-old man moves on a night when his alpha's wolf has just done something unprecedented in 600 years. Tenley had a ruling already half-drafted in his head before he had walked down the corridor. Tenley had been ready for tonight, or for some version of tonight, in a way Devon had not. He filed that. He did not show it. He thanked Tenley for his counsel. He said he would consider it. He said he would have an answer by dawn. Tenley nodded, satisfied, and left. And Devon sat down in his father's chair and stared at the little carved wolf on the desk and felt the silent, live weight of his own wolf inside him refusing to speak. And he thought, for the first time, that the question of why the wolf had chosen Cleopatra might be less urgent than the question of why Lord Tenley had been ready. The second knock at the door, an hour later, was Seraphine. He had been expecting her. He had not been expecting her to come alone, without her father, without a guard, in a plain gray wool dress with her hair unbraided and the river pearls gone. She sat down across from him without asking, and folded her hands on the desk, and looked at him with the level, steady gaze of a woman who had spent the last 2 hours doing the math on her own life. She said she had a question, and she would like an honest answer. He said he would try. She said, had he, at any point in the last 6 months of their betrothal, felt anything for her that resembled love? He opened his mouth to lie. He closed it. He said no. He said respect, deep respect and admiration, and the willingness to build a life together, and gratitude. But not love. Seraphine nodded once. She said she had thought so. She said she had been making peace with it. She said tonight, watching his hand move without him, she had felt something she had not expected to feel, which was relief. Because she had spent 6 months preparing to be a Luna no one's wolf had chosen. And now she did not have to. She said her father would rage. She said her father would push for war over the insult. She said she would not let him. She said she was telling Devon this so that when dawn came and the council convened, he would know that she would not be standing behind any motion to put the crown back on her head. Then she stood up and walked to the door, and with her hand on it, she turned and said quietly that whoever the Omega was, Devon owed it to her to find out before he let the council decide her. Because the wolf might have chosen ordinary, but ordinary was not the same as nothing. And someone in this pack house had been ready for tonight before tonight happened. And Seraphine did not like the smell of that any more than Devon did. Then she was gone too, and Devon sat alone with the silent wolf and the carved figure, and the realization that the 2 strongest women in the pack house tonight had both, in different rooms, told him the same thing in different words, which was that the answer to what had happened in the throne hall was not going to be found in the throne hall. He went to the Western Tower himself, 2 hours before dawn. The guards at the foot of the stairs were his own men, and they straightened when they saw him and asked no questions. The guards at the chamber door unbolted it for him and stepped back into the corridor at his nod, and Devon walked into the room alone and pulled the door shut behind him. And he stopped 2 paces inside, because Cleopatra was asleep. She was sitting up against the headboard of the narrow bed, with the wool blanket pulled across her lap, and the puppy curled in the crook of her elbow. And her head had tipped sideways against her own shoulder, and the crown had slipped down over one ear at an absurd angle, and her mouth was slightly open, and she was breathing the way an exhausted person breathes, deep and slow and unguarded. Devon stood in the doorway and looked at her, and the wolf inside him, which had been refusing speech for 2 years and refusing it most pointedly for the last 6 hours, made a low sound. Not a word, not a growl. A small, almost embarrassed noise, like a thing acknowledging that it had been caught out. Devon closed his eyes. He counted to 10. He opened them. He crossed the room very quietly and sat down in the wooden chair by the fire, and the puppy lifted her head and looked at him and did not bark, only watched him with her dark eyes. And after a moment, she put her chin back down on Cleopatra's wrist and went back to sleep. Devon watched the Omega breathe. He had been Alpha of Iron Crown for 9 years. He had sat across tables from kings. He had killed men with his hands. He had buried a wife. He had not, in all of that time, ever sat in a chair and watched a stranger sleep and felt his own chest unclench. And the unclenching frightened him more than anything that had happened in the throne hall. He cleared his throat. Cleopatra came awake the way servants come awake. In a single instant, no transition. Her eyes snapped open and found him, and her whole body went rigid against the headboard. And the puppy stirred and grumbled and resettled, and Cleopatra did not move. He held up both his hands, palms out, the universal gesture of a man trying not to be a threat. He said her name. He said it carefully, as if it might break. She did not answer. He said he was not here to hurt her. He said he was not here to take the crown. He said he was here to ask her a question, and he would like her to answer it without fear of what he would do with the answer. She watched him. She did not speak. He understood that asking an Omega not to be afraid of an Alpha was like asking water to not be wet. He tried a different approach. He said his wolf had not spoken to him in 2 years, since his Luna died. He said he had believed his wolf was dead. He said tonight in the throne hall his wolf had taken his body and crossed the hall and put the crown on her head, and his wolf would not now tell him why. And he was sitting in this chair because he did not know what else to do, and because somewhere in the pack house someone had been ready for tonight before tonight happened. And he needed to understand which of the things happening to him was the wolf's doing, and which was a man's. He said all of that in a low, even voice, looking at the fire, not at her, because he could feel that looking at her made her breathing change. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, in the smallest voice he had ever heard a grown person use, that something had happened in the antechamber before the ceremony. She told him about the rag. She told him about the consecrated water going still in a way water did not go still. She told him that when the water went still, her heartbeat had slowed, not from fear, but from the feeling of someone walking into a room she had not known she was waiting in. She did not say it well. She had no vocabulary for it. She said she was sorry. She said she had not done anything. She said she had not asked for any of it. Devin listened. The wolf inside his chest made the small, embarrassed sound again. He understood, sitting there in the wooden chair by the fire, that whatever had happened in the antechamber had happened to both of them, and that he had mistaken his own version of it for grief, and that his wolf had recognized something through the 3 stone walls of the pack house that he himself could not name, and had not been able to wait for the ceremony to end before it acted. He understood, further, that none of that gave him a single word he could say to his council at dawn. There was no bloodline. There was no prophecy. There was no right. There was a stillness in a basin of water, and a stillness in a chest and a wolf that would not explain itself. And Lord Tenley was going to walk into the council chamber in 2 hours with a half-drafted ruling that pensioned this woman off to a vassal village and closed the door on the whole night. And Devin was going to have to decide, with no mythological alibi and no convenient secret in her blood, what he believed. He looked at her finally. Her eyes, he saw now, were gray. Not the polished, tempered gray of Seraphine's. A softer gray, the color of the inside of a river stone. She was watching him the way a small animal watches a larger one, alert for the next motion. He said very quietly that he believed her. He said it was not a verdict. He said it was only a starting place. He said the council would convene in 2 hours, and he did not yet know what he was going to argue, and he would not lie to her about that. He said the only thing he could promise her was that no one was going to take the crown off her head against her will tonight, and that if it came off, it would come off because she said it could. He watched her hear that. He watched it take a long moment to land, because nothing in 11 years of her life had prepared her for the sentence whose own will mattered, applied to her. Her eyes filled. She did not let the tears fall. She nodded once, small. The puppy, who had been listening the way puppies listen, with her ears half-cocked, stretched and yawned and put her paw across Cleopatra's wrist as if anchoring her. Devin stood up. He said he would send Polly up before dawn. He said he would not come back into this room himself until she sent for him, or until the council was concluded. He paused at the door. He said, without turning, that the puppy had been Mia's, and that he had not been able to look at her in 2 years, and that he was grateful Cleopatra had been kind to her. Then he left. The council convened at the first true gray of dawn. The chamber was smaller than the throne hall, oak-paneled and circular, with a long table of black wood and 12 carved chairs around it. Devin sat at the head. Polly sat at his right, because the priestess sat at the right of the alpha in matters of right. Lord Tenley sat 3 chairs down on the left, because the senior counselor sat at the left of the priestess in matters of law. Seraphine's father, Lord Merrick of Stonewatch, had been invited as a courtesy and had refused. Seraphine had sent a sealed letter in his place, which sat unopened in front of Devin's hand. The other 9 council seats were filled. The room smelled of beeswax and old leather, and the faint cold of a winter morning seeping in under the door. The Omega was not in the room. The puppy, against all protocol, was. She had refused to leave the Western Tower without Cleopatra, and Cleopatra had refused to come down to the council without her, and Polly had ruled that the animal could attend, and so the puppy lay on the rug at Cleopatra's feet outside the chamber door where the women waited to be cold. Inside, Tenley made his motion. He had cleaned up the language from the version he had floated to Devin in the study. He spoke of the Alpha's grief, of the documented phenomenon of bereaved wolves making erratic choices, of the dignity of the Stonewatch Alliance, of the importance of restoring order before the broader pack heard of what had happened. He proposed that the crown be removed from the Omega at the Alpha's own hand, in keeping with ancient law, that the placement be declared a casualty of mourning, that the Omega be granted a lifetime pension and a quiet placement in a vassal village under a different name, that Seraphine be recrowned at the next full moon, and that the night be entered into the council records as a private matter of the Alpha's health. It was a clean motion. It was a merciful motion. 6 of the 11 other counselors nodded as he laid it out. Devon listened. He did not speak. When Tenley finished, Devon turned instead to Polly. He asked the High Priestess for her reading of the rite. Polly folded her hands on the table. She said the rite had not been broken. She said the crown had been placed by the Alpha's hand. She said the law allowing the Alpha to unmake the placement at dawn was real and was his to invoke. She said, however, that the law was a permission, not a command, and that in 40 years of priestesshood, she had never seen a wolf take control of an Alpha's body in the middle of a rite, and that she was not prepared, in her professional opinion as High Priestess of Iron Crown, to call what had happened last night a casualty of mourning, because she had felt something in the throne hall when she crouched in front of the Omega that she had felt only twice before in her life, both times in the presence of true claimings, and she would not lie to this council to tidy the night up. The chamber went very still. Tenley's jaw set. 2 of the 6 nodding counselors stopped nodding. Devon waited. Then he said, without raising his voice, that he had a second question for the council before any motion was put to vote, and that the question was this. He said he wanted to know which member of the council had been ready last night before the ceremony for a contingency that no one in this room could have predicted. He said he had received a half-drafted ruling in his study within the hour of the crown being placed, and he found that timing remarkable. He said he was not yet accusing anyone of anything. He was simply asking. He looked, when he asked, at Lord Tenley. Tenley held his eyes. Tenley was old, and Tenley was disciplined, and Tenley had sat on this council for 40 years, and his face did not change. But the man 2 seats down from Tenley, a younger lord named Corwin, who had married into Tenley's family the previous spring, looked at Tenley, and that was enough. Devon saw it. Polly saw it. 3 other counselors saw it. The chamber, which had been a room of men debating a mercy, became in an instant a room of men recalculating their alliances. Tenley said evenly that he had drafted the language in advance because he had foreseen the possibility that the Alpha's grief might disrupt the rite, and that foresight was the duty of a senior counselor, and that he resented the implication. It was a good answer. It was almost true. Devon did not believe it. He said mildly that he would like the council to recess for 1 hour while he spoke with the Omega in this chamber in front of all of them, and that he would make his determination after. Tenley opened his mouth to object. Polly cut him off. The priestess outranked the counselor in matters of right, and the priestess said the recess was granted. The counselors filed out. Tenley went last, and his eyes touched Devon's once on the way past, and Devon saw in them, for the first time in his life, something that was not loyalty. He sat alone in the council chamber for several minutes after they were gone. Then he opened Seraphine's letter. It was 3 sentences long. Seraphine wrote that she had spent the night thinking, that she would not stand for recrowning under any circumstances, and that she had a piece of information her father did not know she had, which was that Lord Tenley's family had been quietly buying up land in 2 of Iron Crown's border vassal villages for the last 18 months, including the village where a particular Omega had been born to a particular laundress, and that Seraphine had no idea what it meant, but she suspected Devon would. He read it twice. He set it down. He pressed his hands flat against the table the way he had pressed them against the desk in his study. And inside his chest, very quietly, the wolf shifted its weight, and for the first time in 2 years, he felt it lean toward him as if it were going to speak. He waited. The wolf did not, yet. But it was close. He stood up. He opened the chamber door. He nodded to Polly, and Polly nodded to Cleopatra, and the Omega rose from the bench in the corridor, with the crown still crooked on her head and the puppy at her heels. And she walked into the council chamber of Iron Crown on her bare feet. And Devon held the door for her, and the wolf inside him hummed once, low, and was quiet again. And he understood that whatever was about to happen in this room was going to happen because of a man's choices, not because of a wolf's verdict. And that was, perhaps, exactly the way the wolf had wanted it. He did not seat her at the foot of the table. He pulled out the chair at his right, the chair Polly had been sitting in, and Polly moved without comment to the chair on his left, and Cleopatra, who had clearly never sat at a table of this kind in her life, sat down in it because she had been told to, and because by now she had stopped trying to predict what would be asked of her next. The puppy lay across her feet under the table. Devon waited until the council had filed back in and taken their seats. He did not begin with an accusation. He began with a question. He turned to Cleopatra, and he asked her, gently, in front of 11 counselors and a high priestess, to tell the room what had happened in the antechamber before the ceremony, exactly as she had told him in the Western Tower. Cleopatra's hands gripped each other in her lap so hard the knuckles went white. She did not look at the counselors. She looked at the wood of the table in front of her, and she told it. She told it about the rag falling into the consecrated water by accident. She told it about wringing it out so no one would know. She told it about the surface of the water going still in a way water did not go still. She told it about her heartbeat slowing. She used her own words, which were small and unliterary and not the words a noblewoman would have used, and the council listened to her in a silence that grew with every sentence. When she finished, Polly spoke. The high priestess said, for the record of the council, that the consecrated water in the basin had been examined by her own hand after the ceremony, when it spilled across the throne hall flagstones, and that the water had retained its blessing, which meant the basin had not been desecrated by the rag, which meant the stillness Cleopatra had reported was not a fault in the rite. She said the stillness was a phenomenon she did not have a doctrinal name for, and she would not assign it one prematurely, but she would not let it be dismissed as a servant's nervous imagination either. Tenley shifted in his seat. Devon let him shift. Then Devon said, still mild, still even, that he had a second matter to bring before the council, which was the matter of certain land purchases made in 2 border vassal villages over the last 18 months by a family represented in this room. He did not name Tenley. He did not need to. He said he had learned of the purchases from a source he trusted, and that the purchases included the village in which the Omega ceded to his right had been born, and that the council would understand his curiosity as to why a senior counselor's family would be quietly acquiring land in a village whose only notable export, as far as the records showed, was a single laundress's surviving daughter. The chamber was, again, very still. Tenley's face did not change, but his hand on the table closed slowly into a fist. The younger Lord Corwin had gone the color of milk. Devon waited. He did not ask a question. He let the silence be the question. It was Corwin who broke. He was young, and he was newly married into the family, and he had not yet learned the 70-year-old discipline of his father-in-law's face, and he said, in a voice that came out half a register too high, that it had not been about her, that no one had known about her, that the land purchases were about the river crossing and the toll rights, and that was all. He said it too fast. He said too much. Tenley closed his eyes. The chamber understood, in the same heartbeat, that Corwin had just confirmed 3 things he had not been asked to confirm: that the purchases existed, that they were Tenley's, and that there was a her in them at all. Devon did not smile. He turned slowly to Tenley. He said that the council would be hearing a fuller account of the toll rights in due course. He said that for now, the question before them was the crown. He said he was prepared to make his determination. He turned to Cleopatra. He asked her, in front of the council, whether she wished the crown to remain on her head. He said the question was hers to answer, and the answer would be respected whichever way she gave it. He said no harm would come to her either way. He said she should take her time. Cleopatra lifted her face. She looked, not at him, but at Polly. Polly nodded, once, encouraging. Cleopatra looked at the table again. She was quiet for a long count. Then she said, in the same small voice she had used in the Western Tower, that she did not know what the crown meant. She said she had been an Omega for 11 years, and she did not know what a Luna was. She said she did not know how to be one, and she did not know if she wanted to be one, and she did not know if the wolf had been right. But she said, very slowly, that the stillness in the antechamber had been the first thing in 11 years that had felt like being seen, and she was not yet willing to give it back. She said that if it was the council's will to take the crown off her head, she would not fight it, because she did not know how to fight anything. But she would not, herself, ask for it to be removed. She said all of that with her eyes on the wood of the table, and when she finished, she put her hands flat against her own knees the way she had seen Polly put her hands flat against the council table, as if borrowing the gesture. Devon looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the council. He said the Omega's will had been heard. He said the law of the crown gave him the permission to unmake the placement at his own hand at dawn, and he would not be invoking that permission. He said the crown would remain where it had been placed. He said the Omega would be lodged in the Luna's chambers under his personal protection, while the council investigated the matter of the land purchases. He said any counselor who wished to register a formal objection could do so in writing within 7 days, and that any counselor who wished to discuss the matter of border vassal villages with him privately was welcome to request an audience. He looked, when he said the last sentence, at Tenley. Tenley met his eyes. Tenley said nothing. Then Devon stood up. The council stood up with him, the way a council always stood when its alpha stood, and Cleopatra, after a confused half-second, stood up too. And the puppy scrambled out from under the table, and Polly offered Cleopatra her arm, and the High Priestess of Ironcrown walked the Omega out of the council chamber on her own arm in front of 11 counselors, which was a gesture that no one in the room missed. Devon waited until they were gone. Then he sat back down. He gestured to the captain of his personal guard, who had been standing inside the door. He said, quietly, that Lord Tenley was not to leave the packhouse grounds, and that Lord Corwin was to be brought to a private chamber and questioned in detail about toll rights, and that the questioning was to be conducted by Polly, because the priestess was permitted to invoke truth-right, and the council was not. He said all of that without looking at Tenley. Tenley, when he stood to leave, did so without speaking, and the 2 guards who had been waiting in the corridor fell in behind him without touching him. and the chamber emptied. And Devon sat alone at the head of the long black table and put his hands flat against the wood and felt the wolf inside his chest stretch and stretch. And finally, after 2 years, after a night, after a crown placed and a council survived, the wolf spoke. It did not say much. It said her name. Just that. Cleopatra. Not the throne hall name, not the Luna name, but the name her mother had whispered to her once when Cleopatra was 8 years old, and burning with the same winter cough that would take her mother a year later. The diminutive only her mother had used, a soft 2-syllable shortening that Cleopatra had not heard out loud or inside her own head in 18 years. Cleo. The wolf said Cleo inside Devon's chest, in the wolf's own low voice, and Devon, alone in the empty council chamber, put his head down on his own forearms and wept for the first time since Mia's burial. He did not understand. He did not need to understand yet. The wolf did not explain. The wolf simply said the name and then settled, the way an animal settles when it has finally gotten home. And inside Devon, the long hollow space where the second consciousness lived was, for the first time in 2 years, occupied. He sat in the council chamber for a long time. The morning grew. A servant came in to lay a fresh fire and saw him and left without speaking. When he finally stood up, his eyes were dry and his hands were steady, and he understood that the work of the day was not done and might not be done for weeks. He walked out of the council chamber and up the stairs to the Luna's quarters, and Polly met him at the door. And Polly said Cleopatra was sleeping, and the puppy was sleeping. And one of Polly's own priestess acolytes, a steady young woman named Tenley, no relation, the name was common in Iron Crown, was sitting with them. And Devon should rest, because the next 7 days were going to ask things of him he had not been asked in a long while. He nodded. He did not go in. He went instead to his own chambers, and he slept for the first time in 2 years, without the wolf's absence sitting on his chest like a stone. The investigation took 11 days. The truth-right questioning of Lord Corwin took 2 of them. Polly was patient, and Polly was thorough, and Corwin, who was young and frightened, and not, in the end, an evil man, told her everything. The land purchases had begun the spring after Mia's death, when Lord Tenley had calculated that a widowed alpha with no heir and no wolf was a vulnerable alpha, and that the right Luna placed beside him at the right moment could shape Iron Crown's borders for a generation. Tenley had not picked Seraphine. Tenley had supported Merock of Stonewatch's offer of Seraphine because Seraphine's father owed Tenley's family 3 old debts that Merock did not know Tenley had inherited from a cousin. The plan had been simple and patient. Crown Seraphine. Let her produce an heir. Let Tenley's debts come due against Merock at the moment of greatest leverage. The land purchases in the border villages had been the second layer of the plan, in case the first layer failed, in case the rite went wrong, in case the alpha's grief disrupted the ceremony in any of the ways Tenley had read about in old council records. The purchases gave Tenley a quiet hold on the villages from which any contingency Omega might plausibly be drawn, including the village in which Cleopatra had been born. Because Tenley had read the packhouse servant rolls, and Tenley had cross-referenced births, and Tenley had been preparing for 15 versions of the night the crown was placed. And the version where the wolf chose at random had been one of them. And Tenley had been ready to use the landhold to make any chosen Omega disappear into a vassal pension before anyone could ask questions. He had simply not anticipated the part where Devon's wolf, which Tenley had been told for 2 years was dormant, would speak again. Polly reported all of this to Devon in the council chamber on the 11th day. Devon listened. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he asked her what she recommended. Polly said that the law of Iron Crown permitted exile in place of execution where the council chose mercy, and that she would, in her capacity as High Priestess, recommend mercy, because Tenley had not killed anyone, and had not yet acted on the landhold, and because the pack did not need a public bloodletting in the first month of a new luna. Devon nodded. He chose exile. Tenley was stripped of his council seat and his lands, and given 72 hours to leave Iron Crown's borders with what he could carry. And he went. And that was the end of him in this story. Corwin was permitted to keep his marriage and his life on the condition that he served 2 years as a vassal steward in the very village in which Cleopatra had been born, which was a punishment that Polly had designed with her tongue in her cheek. The land purchases were unwound. The toll rights were returned to the crown. Seraphine of Stonewatch returned to her father's house with her dignity intact, and a private letter from Devon that thanked her, in plain words, for being braver than he had been on the night of the crowning. She would, in 3 years' time, marry a quiet northern alpha of her own choosing and be very happy. But that is a different story. Cleopatra remained in the Luna's quarters. She did not, at first, do anything that resembled being a Luna. She slept a great deal. She let Polly and the acolyte Tenley feed her. She let the puppy, who had been given the name Mia would have given her had Mia lived, a small, clean name, just Hound, because Cleopatra had a horror of over-decorating, sleep on the foot of her bed. She did not see Devon for 4 days, by her own request, because she said she needed to be in a room without an alpha in it for a while. And Devon, who had been an alpha his whole life and had never been told by anyone that his presence might be a weight, accepted this with a startled grace and stayed away. On the 5th day she sent for him. He came. He sat in a chair across the room from her, not close, and she sat on the edge of the bed with the crown in her lap, because she had finally taken it off. And she held it out to him, and she said she wanted to give it back. He did not take it. He said she could give it back if she wished. He said he would not stop her. He said he wanted her to know, before she decided, that his wolf had spoken to him in the council chamber the morning of the ruling, for the first time in 2 years, and that the wolf had said her name, and that the wolf had not, since, explained itself any further, and that he did not know what any of it meant either. He said he was not asking her to be his Luna because of any of that. He was asking her, if she wished it, to stay in the pack house as a free woman, under no obligation, while the two of them figured out what the wolf had done and what, if anything, they wanted to do with it. He said the crown could sit on a shelf for a year while they figured it out, and the council would have to live with that, because the council had a great deal of recent humility to be getting on with. Cleopatra listened. She looked at the crown in her lap. She looked at the puppy on the bed. She looked at him. She said, slowly, that no one had ever asked her what she wished before, and that she would like some time to learn what the word meant in her own mouth. Then she set the crown, not on her head, and not in his hands, but on the small table by the bed, where Mia's whittled wolf had once sat on Devon's desk, and she said she would stay. 3 weeks later, on a morning that smelled of late winter beginning to think about spring, Cleopatra was sitting on the low stone wall of the kitchen garden with a wooden bowl in her lap and Hound the puppy chewing on the toe of her boot, and she was shelling peas. She was shelling them because she had asked the head cook, a wide, cheerful woman named Yale's sister, confusingly also named in the packhouse style, if there was any work she could do with her hands, because 11 years of scrubbing had built a person who did not know how to sit still. And a free woman of the packhouse was not expected to scrub, and Cleopatra had been climbing the walls of the Luna's quarters by the end of the second week. The cook had given her peas. The peas were old, from the last of the winter stores, and tough, and they needed someone patient. Cleopatra was patient. Devon found her there. He was coming back from a council session that had run long, his collar undone and his hair pushed back from his forehead, and he stopped at the gate of the kitchen garden when he saw her, and he leaned against the gatepost and watched her shell peas for a moment without speaking. The puppy noticed him first and thumped her tail against the wall, but did not get up, because the puppy had decided in 11 days that Cleopatra's boot was more interesting than any alpha. Cleopatra looked up. The stillness in her chest settled. Not like a verdict, not like a thunderclap, just the quiet shift of a room rearranging itself to make space for someone who belonged in it. She did not say anything about it. He did not either. They had stopped trying to name it 3 weeks ago, and the not naming was, both of them had discovered, a relief. He came into the garden. He sat down on the wall beside her, not touching, leaving a hand's width of cold stone between them. He looked at the peas. He said they were old. She said she knew. He said he had spent an hour this morning listening to a vassal lord argue about a fence, and that he would, given the choice, rather shell peas. She said he could have half the bowl. He took it. He shelled peas with the careful concentration of a man who had not done it since he was 9 years old and visiting his grandmother. The puppy, satisfied that both of her people were sitting still and within reach, sighed and rolled onto her back and went to sleep with her paws in the air. Cleopatra watched a sparrow land on the far wall and pick at a winter seed head. She watched her own breath make a small cloud in the cold air. She watched Devon's hands, large and scarred and surprisingly deft, splitting a pea pod down its seam. She said, after a while, that she had been thinking about the crown. He kept shelling. He said yes. She said she did not yet want to wear it. She said she might want to wear it one day, when she had learned what it meant, and when she had learned what she meant, and when the packhouse had learned to look at her as a person instead of as the verdict of a broken animal. She said one day might be a year. It might be 2. He nodded. He said the crown could wait. He said he could wait. Then he said, looking at the pea in his hand and not at her, that he was not waiting for her to become anything in particular. He was simply, for the first time in a long while, not in a hurry. She heard the difference. She did not say anything. She passed him another handful of pods. He took them. The sparrow finished with the seed head and flew away. The puppy snored. Somewhere across the courtyard, a stable boy was singing the wrong words to an old song, cheerfully and badly. Cleopatra, who had scrubbed the floors of this packhouse for 11 years without ever being looked at directly, sat on a cold stone wall in the late winter sun and shelled peas beside the alpha of Iron Crown. And no one came to fetch her, and no one came to send her away. And the stillness in her chest was not the stillness of a held breath, or the stillness of consecrated water, or the stillness of a room she had not known she was waiting in. It was just the stillness of a morning. She found she could live in it. There were a few moments in this one that stayed with me. The puppy crossing the throne hall on her 2 big paws to lie down across a stranger's feet. Seraphine taking off her own pearls and walking out of the hall with her chin up. The wolf finally sang a name no one but a dead mother had ever used.
I would love to know which one landed for you.
See you in the next story.